As you're reading the ingredients for the cake that you're going to bake tomorrow, you notice that the recipe calls for a half a teaspoon of salt. Seriously? That tiny little amount? Why even bother? Hey there, I'm Valerie from Sentimental Sweets by Val. Let me tell you why salt is important in your baking. Salt is a flavor enhancer. Salt balances sweetness, which is crucial when you want that just right level of sweet in your baked goods. But you need to get the amount right. Too much salt in your cake can have a harsh, bitter, and, well, salty taste. Now, in leaven baked goods, too much salt can weaken the gluten structure and cause your cake to become overly dense, or even cause it to fall. If you don't put any salt in a cake, it's going to likely taste flat and bland. The good news is it probably won't be a disaster, as your icings or fillings may be enough to compensate. But why take a chance? You worked hard on that cake, and ingredients are not cheap anymore. But Valerie, I'm watching my sodium intake. Valid concern. To put it in perspective, if you bake a cake with 3 cups of flour and use a 1/4 teaspoon of salt per cup, that's only 3/4 teaspoon of salt spread over the entire cake. Now, if you need some more exact numbers, a slice of cake can have anywhere from 110 to 400 milligrams of sodium per slice, depending on the recipe. The amount of sodium you're consuming at one time in a slice of cake really isn't all that much, but the effect that it can have on your flavor can be significant. Now, if you're on a severely sodium restricted diet, take this into consideration when you're calculating your daily sodium allotment. And if you need to reduce or eliminate the amount of salt you're using in your cake, keep in mind that it might taste a bit different. Now, how much salt should you use in a cake? A general rule of thumb is about 1/8 to 1/4 teaspoon of salt per cup of flour. I have seen some recommendations as high as 1/4 to 1/2 teaspoon of salt per cup. Which way to go? Keep in mind that you might have other sources of salt in your cake. Wait, what? And just because you didn't add any extra salt doesn't mean that there's no salt in your cake. Salted butter and baking soda are additional sources of salt in your cake. Now, there's an ongoing argument among bakers as to whether or not it makes any difference to use salted versus unsalted butter. A single stick of salted butter can contain up to 1/4 teaspoon of salt. This is going to depend on the brand. The thought process as to why not to use salted butter is you're, number one, more precisely controlling the amount of salt that you're putting in your cake. And since salt is a preservative, salted butter has a longer shelf life than unsalted butter. Some bakers feel that unsalted butter is fresher. Now, what do? I use unsalted butter for both of those reasons, and I have to buy salted butter for my husband's toast because he can certainly tell the difference. Now, another source for salt in your cake, as we mentioned, is baking soda, sodium bicarbonate. 1 teaspoon of baking soda has about 1,260 milligrams of sodium. 1 teaspoon of salt can have up to 2,300 milligrams of sodium. What would I do with this tidbit of information? Well, instead of getting out my calculator, I'd be sure to use unsalted butter when my cake calls for baking soda, and I'd lean towards 1/8 to 1/4 teaspoon salt per cup of flour. Now, this information is geared towards giving you some general guidelines. At some point, this is going to come down to individual taste preference. So if you're trying to precisely tweak a cake or figure out why yours didn't turn out the way you thought, go back and look at how much sodium you have in your cake. Now you may want to break out that calculator. Now that we've considered all of that, there's still one more thing to think about where salt in your cake is concerned. What type of salt to use? Well, we have table salt, iodized salt, pink Himalayan salt, kosher salt, the list goes on. But before you break out that pink Himalayan salt to put in your cake, keep this in mind. Table salt is the most common type of salt used in baking. It has small, uniform crystals that dissolve easily and are consistent for measuring. Now, table salt can be iodized or non-iodized. Iodized salt is just that, salt that has iodine added for nutritional value. You are better off using non-iodized salt in a cake, as iodine salt can impart a slight chemical or metallic taste, especially in recipes with a delicate flavor. Iodized salt is also denser than other salt. 1 teaspoon of iodized salt can weigh slightly more than 1 teaspoon of non-iodized salt. So unless you're actually weighing your salt, you could be using more by volume. Now, in case I have you totally scratching your head, let me sum all this up. Number one, salt does play a crucial role in the flavor of your cake. Yes, you can bake a cake without salt, it just might not taste as good. Remember the sources of salt in your cake: salted butter, the salt you added, and baking soda. Now, to be the most precise, use unsalted butter and non-iodized table salt. Start out with 1/8 to 1/4 teaspoon of salt per cup of flour. Adjust to taste, but don't use more than 1/2 teaspoon of salt per cup of flour. Now, I hope this segment has made you a little more aware of the role that salt plays in your cakes and has given you the information to decide what and how much to use. Follow me for more baking tips, and if you're into vintage baking, check out my website at sentimentalsweetsbyval.com. You can also find that cookbook that I got the wild idea to restore. So until next time, happy baking.